So this is my first time doing something new. I haven't really went out of my way to engage with the internet in such a way that I'm making a podcast or a video. I have mostly kept myself to writing papers because that's where my strengths lie. Quite immediately, I've felt a sort of comfort in uh, writing. First of all, because I'm not coming up with words um, at the go. And that's one of the main difficulties I think I'm gonna start finding in doing this format. Um, but it also comes with something pretty familiar and kind of leading up to the conversation I want to talk about. Uh, since this is my first time doing a podcast or anything of the sort, it comes with a familiar anxiety, namely that at what point do I have something worth saying? And that's kind of the general sense of having a claim to saying something that I want to explore. This I want to treat as a personal introduction to the question of para academics. And by para academics, we mean those sorts of engagements that are academic, that are um, operating besides the institutions of universities or research centers, or essentially decentralization of academia within certain given structures. We're finding this, and I'm gonna be leading up to this discussion a lot in a movement in philosophy called speculative realism, where blogs are starting to dominate, for example, how these sorts of discussions proliferate. We're starting to find a lot of people turning to YouTube. I myself, I'm responding now through podcast or some sort of recording as a way of trying to disseminate information that operates to some extent besides the academic setting. And I mentioned this anxiety of at what point do I have something worth saying as a leverage point to discuss academia, because this is similar anxiety that I know I have faced and many people have faced in terms of engaging with academia, particularly at the levels of undergrad and graduate studies. We find that academia often operates under a sort of underlying principle of sufficient credentials. This is not to say that people haven't earned or done hard work towards being a professor or something of the sort. Uh, but it's interesting the way in which it navigates the claim to the space to speak, the space to do something new or something innovative. I have found that, for example, in my experience under my undergrad studying philosophy, I studied under an analytic school, which is a school of philosophy that is very much under the, very much dominating the North American Anglo philosophical space. Um, this type of philosophy, analytic philosophy, places a strong focus on clarity of language, short forms of writing, and um, also the use of logic. If I'm able to put something into words, then that's the first step to me doing something philosophically important, that I can express it in language, and that besides this linguistic expression, I can also put it into a logical form. And from this logical form, I can also verify how is it that it operates, how it has ultimately logical underlying operations. Um, on a side note, to this side note, analytic philosophy attempts to take out for lack of a better expression, all the bullshit out of philosophy, in many senses, speculations or ungrounded claims, by having this sort of logical rigor, this sort of purification of language. Analytic philosophy is trying to reduce the bounds of philosophical discourse as a way of legitimating what is being said in philosophy. Ultimately, I've been very much disenchanted with the movement in many respects, especially when I started flirting with what is often called the continental tradition. I have written about this sort of divide before, and personally, I think that in many ways there's a sort of unfounded nature to the split between what's called continental and analytic philosophy, as if they were two cultures quite apart from each other, when quite ostensively in our eyes, we can see that romantic approaches to philosophy are already within the English tradition, and scientific approaches to philosophy we can also find in various places that are considered the continent of Europe. But most importantly, and why I wanted to explain a little bit about what analytic philosophy is because the university I studied under was dominated by this school. Many of my concerns in philosophy, which have been in many respects politically motivated or motivated by my own personal experience, kind of felt on a sort of sense of underwhelming when I came to be taught by these folk. I had a pretty particular interaction. I mean, many of them, but one of them that I find quite funny because someone who is talked about in the sociology department quite often. The name is Michel Foucault, a theorist quite known within what we may call postmodernism. Was not known by anyone in my department of philosophy, even though Foucault is primarily approached as a philosopher, as a contemporary philosopher that has taken quite a degree of influence in a lot of philosophical discourses today. His influence extends to folk in queer theory like Judith Butler, or people in biopolitics like Giorgio Agamben. That is to say that it showed me a blind spot in what my mentors could teach me, and it made me realize that despite all the credentials, they were still unable to engage with certain conversations. When it came to any sort of issue of feminism or queer theory or engaging with critical race theory or anything of the sort, these folk were quite unable to engage with this. One of the problems I immediately found was that I myself, being a person who speaks multiple languages, particularly Spanish and English, there were many aspects of how they conceive the world through the English language that didn't quite translate to the Spanish, of course. But in this movement from linguistic expressions to logical forms, I kept finding that there was an incongruency of how is it that these people thought about language, and what is the status of language in what it makes apparent about the world. It's not that just simply transforming it into a logical form helps, but that there's idiosyncratic tensions in this reduction into the logical form of language. I had many occasions where all my mentors admitted that the only language they knew was English, and that proved to be another blind spot to how they were able to engage with a lot of discussions from other parts of the world. Particularly French theory, which is often dreaded in North America, thrives heavily on linguistic puns and play. The psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan will constantly play on linguistic equivocation, but with the intention of showing you something about the nature of language and the nature of that person, whoever is formulated in some form or another through language. And these were many aspects of what my education wasn't able to teach me, despite all credentials that these people had. It's not just that they claimed to have, but they had under an institution that had granted it to them. Under that institution, they were authorities of the subject matter, but interestingly enough, their sense of authority oftentimes clashed with their ability to think. They could only think authority, and anything that was not at that level was completely dismissed. Many of my early experiments with philosophy were quite dismissed by the philosophy department, but welcomed quite much so by the English department and the classics professor at the school. I would find some solidarity with various folk in the sociology department, and even started flirting with psychology, because I would find that some of these discussions that are often labeled quite inappropriately postmodern would be dismissed from any form of conversation as forms of relativism that would answer to nothing, except oftentimes they do answer to a lot of issues that are quite distinct from how these academic philosophers in the analytic tradition often formulated. But I should note that part of the difficulty was also the fact that there is a generational gap in the school I was taught. The youngest professor there was about 30 years old. He tried to bridge the gap between continental and analytic philosophy, but I think in trying to do so, he often forgot that there was not much continental philosophy. Anything Marxism, anything existential, phenomenology, psychoanalysis was often just a source of mockery, and that's generally in all of North American academia, for quite broadly speaking, of course. Um, but it was interesting seeing him try to take that on because it opened up a little bit of a channel of communication, but that channel of communication was so minimal that it only showed how restricted my faculty was in able to respond to these kinds of questions. Quite literally to a language that was other than theirs, in the sense of they couldn't speak oftentimes a language other than English, but besides that, they were also not quite able to engage with other ways of expressing philosophy. In quite a literal sense, the means of philosophical expression that these folk had available to them were quite limited. They always had to rely on the English language. They had to always rely on logical form as a way of renouncing a lot of speculative commitments or things that would seem to run counter to contradiction, of course. So, with talking about this source of experiences that I've been having all this way through my academic experience, it's hard to say that this would be a detached conversation, and that's why I'm not giving a sort of introduction that is focused on theory about para-academics or anti-academics. I think the only way in which I can personally at first start this sort of conversation is by talking a little bit about what drove me to para-academics and why I still to this day I'm not certain of whether I want to go back to academia in any particular sense. Maybe I'll go to a conference or two on my own independent research, but it's mostly to tease academia and what it's able to do. And I don't think we can approach this question through theory alone because we encounter these frustrations without quite putting a word to it at first. Towards the end of my experience in academia, I was actually facing this problem as I was starting to feel very frustrated by all these limits to what my professors were able to account for or teach me, especially when the sort of philosophy they were teaching me was starting to become quite obsolete to the current demands of philosophy. Psychoanalysis had started gaining a lot of terrain, quite internationally, and when it comes down to the question of what it's now a speculative realism, I haven't heard of it until I think the last few years I was there. But it was through sources other than my professors that I found out about it. So I had some curious experiences. I remember one time where a professor that was teaching a senior level course on theory of knowledge had actually denied quite a few proposals from his students that tried to engage with social theories of knowledge, social epistemologies. A lot of them were concerned with issues of feminism or social inequality in such a way that they were wondering about how is it that these conditions, these material conditions that constantly affect the knowing subject, the person, how is it that these conditions affect the way in which we know? Those are perfectly legitimate questions in epistemology, in theory of knowledge. They are actually quite heavily present nowadays, but it was a curious thing that the professor refused those questions, which are quite important to his students, and at a point in which he should have, as a teacher, realize that his best way of teaching would have been let them learn. Let them figure out those questions on their own. Especially on a senior level course, it's usually the expectation that you have quite a lot of freedom in terms of what you're looking to study. So in that respect, it showed more of an inadequacy in this professor and his ability to be a teacher and in his ability to account for questions that went against perhaps his own theoretical biases or whatnot. It was quite difficult, and at my university it became more apparent too towards the end of the year. There was a debate where probably my favorite professor, Paul Beach, was in a live debate with another professor over the existence of God, and the way in which they went about philosophizing was very different. Professor Strand was a pretty everyday analytic philosopher. He would appeal constantly to scientific research to try to grant the experience of God, which to a lot of people seems quite out of place. But within analytic philosophy, there's a lot of schools that do that as a form of Christian apologetics. And he tried to use a lot of logical arguments as a way of convincing an audience of university students, which, brave. I don't think that's the way to go about it. But that's why, at least on the end of Beach's side of the debate, he used a lot of jokes. He played around quite a bit and still did arguments that had a logical form too. But it was important to realize that there were a lot of jokes at the expense of Strand that went over his head, and only watching the debate after did he realize that he was being made fun of. And that spawned a whole debate in the department because they couldn't figure out whether there was a legitimacy on the way in which Beach was arguing, and in a sense kind of making a fool of Strand in front of an audience. But as a question of rhetoric, humor has ultimately effect in making a premise more palpable, in making a claim a little bit more easy for a person to take on, and be more receptive to. So why not use rhetoric? If anything, it showed Strand's inability to be flexible in the way in which he explores questions. So if he's frustrated with that question, it's mostly in his own inability to be expressive. But also, if we get rid of arguments to absurdity, argumentum ad absurdum is the fancy word, then we get rid of a lot of key figures in whatever we want to call the philosophical canon as philosophers. One example would be edgy boy Nietzsche. Another example would be Plato. A lot of Platonic dialogues depend on that. Aristotle, who is very much given a lot of weight in terms of being someone who has started this traditional logical form, would be called into question on how he even grounds the principle of non-contradiction. He used a lot of arguments to absurdity in such a way that there's actually quite a few problems on how he founded perhaps the principle of non-contradiction, but that's a different question. But it was interesting watching this debate because it became very apparent that there was something lacking in Strand's notion of what is philosophy, that a philosophical joke went over his head. He was not even able to take note that what had just happened was something that had a big effect on thinking. It was interesting too because at the time I was starting to become a big fan of Jacques Derrida, and I was chatting with Professor Beach about him, and he likes his classical philosophy, so he tried to respond to me through those terms. And he was still able to teach me a little bit about Derrida and also classical philosophy by teaching me a little bit about how I said that we have relationships to text and outside texts in such a way that once I need myth at a certain point when I can't make arguments to make something more apparent. Plato does that at the end of the Republic, where arguments don't actually quite suffice. So one has to start turning to myths and narratives and stories to start working on things. And that's something that Friedrich Nietzsche does too, that he starts highlighting the use of poetic language as quite key to philosophical truth too. So it is particularly this notion of playing with language that gets quite lost there. And it was quite interesting too, because what we were talking about was quite concrete and pretty much there in the debate. But the president of Concordia at the time came by, and we were just chatting. I kind of mentioned to him that we were chatting about Derrida, and he made a odd comment that I still kind of think a little bit about to this day, because I think it's symptomatic of this general inadequacy to be able to be playful with language or being unable to think in a different way. It was Professor President Crispin essentially saying that he was surprised that people still did Derrida. He was surprised that people still did things like Foucault and things of the sort. He immediately talked down to it in a way that he wouldn't even consider it as any sort of viable position. And it was that sort of gesture that made it clear to me that these people didn't even know what hit them. In the case of Strand, he didn't even know what the power of a joke would be. And in the case of President Crispin, I don't think he had a way of even thinking through this question, so he saw it as something to be repudiated against. So, towards the end of my degree, I was doing a course on political philosophy as my senior course, where I did my major thesis of my undergraduate with Professor Beach. And Beach had asked me a question towards the end of one of our classes, where he was wondering where I saw academia going, or, well, more importantly, philosophy going first. And we were kind of wondering whether the university was the place to go, or whether it would be somewhere else. At the time, Beach also seemed pretty disenchanted with his experience at Concordia, which was the school. And it was quite tough navigating that, because I could see him struggling with engaging with students that clearly just went to his classes often as a requirement, or people who didn't really care to take any other thinkers that didn't conform to their own personal ideas seriously. So for a philosophy professor who often likes playing and performing different characters, like he would come by and be Plato one day, or be Aristotle the next day, or something of the sort, it was quite, I can imagine it was quite tough seeing sort of lack of response or lack of enthusiasm, or people who thought about it as, I'm just getting marks for it, I'm not taking anything from it to my life. And that's kind of what stuck with me about the way he taught philosophy, because he would, against the best wishes sometimes of the faculty, not do final exams, because that oftentimes is quite arbitrary in highlighting how is it that someone actually gets shit about philosophy. And oftentimes he would be very open to people, instead of doing an academic paper, maybe writing a script or doing a presentation. And there's been occasions where that didn't quite work out well for him, but it certainly pointed out something about the limits of philosophical expression in any other philosophy class that I had. The fact that I could write a script if I wanted seemed to get that idea that, for example, in the case of Professor Strand, he couldn't understand a joke in a debate because he was so ready to take everything in a logical form. Whereas in the case of Professor Beach and how he taught, it was probably the most effective professor in the sense that he was able to affect his students. He still has meetings with a lot of his old students here and there, and it's quite charming seeing how he has captivated a range of really odd people around that otherwise wouldn't necessarily hang out with one another. It's interesting too because around the time, for example, sometimes we went for a drink while we were working on our major papers. It was three of us, mostly Holly and I, went with Beach sometimes for a drink and wrote our papers with him. And it was really interesting because he would mention that if he could teach a class, he would teach it at a bar because that's where he's happy. He loves having a beer and he loves just hanging out with friends. The academic institution took something away of philosophy from him in such a way that he would he actually stopped teaching, and he realized that it was just another corporate job in some sense. So if he approaches philosophy, he approaches it on, for lack of a better expression, the sidelines. He rather do things in a way that actually made him happy, and I don't think there's something wrong with that. In fact, that's kind of what started driving me away from academia. These people were making me, in a sense, unhappy. Unhappy in that I felt sometimes unseen. For example, if I tried to talk about issues of racism within the school or issues that pertain gender, they were ready with their logical arms, even though oftentimes there were quite contingent aspects to what they based their arguments on. There would be very many occasions where I realized that for me to try to work with these people, I would have to play on their terms. but their terms are the very thing that they're limiting the freedom of philosophy. So maybe I need to change the terms themselves to change philosophy. And that means that I needed to step out of academia in order to actually do a change in philosophy. Philosophy is currently in a crisis that has been interpreted in a lot of different ways. Uh, we can say a little word about people like Jordan Peterson. I don't necessarily agree with him in many respects, but his kind of tantrum is a tantrum in response to a lot of constraints in today's society, particularly academia. And we're finding this in a lot of people that we are essentially demanding to take away their own way of using language to learn a way that reduces it all to just logical expression, for example. That I can't use my everyday language, even though everyone that I'll face in everyday life is going to use everyday language. And there are philosophers in the analytic tradition that have done that, and sometimes they tend to be some of the ones that I can actually get behind at times. But more importantly, who am I philosophizing for? If I'm not philosophizing for a community, why am I using these words that oftentimes just make people lose crap on what I am even trying to say? Conversation oftentimes just starts becoming this sort of looking around each other in such a way that we are actually missing each other. So with these frustrations in academia at the end of my undergrad, I looked at Beach's question, and I think that was exactly the moment where I realized that I couldn't come back to my master's willy-nilly like that, because I would find the same frustrations again. And I knew that that's what would come, because all these symptoms became more apparent in academia over time, constantly. Either by some reactionary response against against radical theory or anything that the students would bring into the mix. It seems to be just generally a problem also in graduate schools, where various professors constantly appeal to their credentials as a way to take down and undermine those who are looking to actually learn from them. The curious ambiguity of philosophy right now is that for all the wisdom that it tries to teach, the figures that are teaching it are not quite wise. We can think of the current scandals with figures like Avital Ronell, who is currently under fire for using a lot of her psychoanalytic rhetoric with her students in a way that they're not necessarily willing to engage with her. That seems to me to be a failure as a teacher, in the sense that you are not willing to speak a language that is other than yours, and as someone who is interested in psychoanalysis, that's pretty bad if you can't learn how to speak someone else's language in that sense. If you're trying to teach to your students, you're not trying to play them into the seduction game of psychoanalytic rhetoric because it keeps it enticing. You find other ways of keeping it enticing that don't need to be that. And that's a problem with academia at the moment. I find that I had a few occasions where I went to a couple conferences internationally to present some of my work. I went to Poland to a conference on contemporary phenomenology because I wanted to do a presentation on Heidegger, Derrida, and Lacan, who I was starting to get into, because I wanted to take on a personal question and see how it was going to be received in an academic setting. That occasion, I wrote about my experience being a multilinguistic person who took on seriously some of the teachings of Heidegger and Derrida and Lacan. In Heidegger, that language is actually our means of access to the world, and language is never in any prior sense logical, so the world is not strictly logical. There's a difference in the way that things are, that sometimes being in a different language, it makes itself apparent as different. Derrida, he was an immigrant and someone who dealt with a lot of ambiguities insofar as this relationship between having a claim to language or being claimed by language and identity was concerned. In his own case, he got a lot of his status as either a citizen or as a Jewish person or as European or African uh, away from him. These things were taken away from him in such a way that a lot of deconstruction could be read as Derrida's attempt to engaging for those tensions. In his case, he talked to us a lot about poets who engage in those tensions in different territories of language. And ultimately, Lacan taught me a lot about psychoanalysis in such a way that I was able to structure very clearly what was happening when at the moments where when I speak myself in Spanish, I speak myself in a way that's very different than English. And even more importantly, something that accents and different inflections teach us is that the moment I speak myself out in either one language, I'm giving away something of myself. So, for example, in English, I have an accent quite clearly, and in Spanish, I do too, because I've been living in the English language for so long. So the way in which my sense of identity has been construed between the two languages um, had become pretty obscure, and I tried to use phenomenology and psychoanalysis to give an account of that experience because my turn away from academia was first of all personal, in that I wanted to see what is it that I lost in the university, and to see if I could do serious work in the world surrounding that. And I still think that's possible. I still think some of my essays at that time still appeal too much to a very strict academic way of writing. It's only recently that I'm starting to feel comfortable with including a lot of things that I think are the contemporary that I need to be. But that was an experiment, and it was interesting because I was engaging with a crowd that was polylinguistic. There were many people from various different places, and most of them didn't speak just one language. And by the end of the presentation, I realized that I could have done without half of the theory that I just mentioned, because all of these people already know this in some sense. They live it. And that's kind of the funny thing of it all, that what I had to come up with a theoretical device for to justify my very existence in here in North America in my university was just everyday life for everyone else there. They already kind of got it in some sense. But it was an interesting experience, and I think having gone there also reassured me that maybe turning away from academia was a good idea. I saw two major keynote speakers get into a conflict. Nicolas de Varenne, who is from the Husserl Archives, and Bonnie Mann, who teaches in the United States and does a lot of prolific work in feminist phenomenology. And it was interesting because at the heart of their discussion was vulnerability, but it seemed like both of them under a lot of different restrictions, questionably justified in either end, they seem to be very resistant to meeting each other up for a conversation. The problem was that the Varenne was giving a presentation about vulnerability and has said that we have to have some foundational sort of trust in the world in order to be able to live existentially in any proper sense. And so we need this sort of foundational sort of trust and vulnerability to face the world. And that was very interesting and all, but I think Vonnie Mann was correct to point out that questions like trust and vulnerability have become pretty gender questions. When one is vulnerable, one is always being vulnerable against some sort of power that is taking advantage of vulnerability, at least in today's society. And Nicolas de Varenne's first response was that he wouldn't disagree with Bonnie Mann, that no one is against her there. But at the same time, he went on to make, I think, in some respects, somewhat pedantic commentaries about how that didn't even need to be discussed here. Except it needed to, because the question was vulnerability and trust in the world. And how can I have a sort of trust into a world where it's even impossible for these people to explore the question of forgiveness, which was quite central to both of their discussions, but forgiveness in such a way that they could have come up with a way of restructuring their ways of thinking, particularly the Varens, because I think he was kind of reactive, unnecessarily so, but also perhaps Bonnie Mann in that her feminism and second wave feminism particularly sometimes actually draws us away from facing the other, which I think is one of the main questions of feminism and community. But in this case, with both Nicolas de Varenne and Bonnie Mann, they were very resistant to it. In fact, I tried to jump between both of them because I was thinking to myself that I'm just a young person who is just kind of curious to see what happened there, and I just kind of want to chat with both of them because I think I see what both of them are trying to do, but I don't see why they're so resistant to each other. So I kept talking with both of them over a few drinks at times, but it was important for me to approach them because I thought to myself, well, if I can maybe help out, foster a space for these people to talk, let's give it a shot. But it was interesting because right away I saw them being resistant to even the idea of that. With Nicolas de Varenne, he actually went insofar as to make an addendum to his work talking about the unforgivable, and claiming that that Bonnie Mann's response was unforgivable, and there's no way in which they can face each other again after that. But it's quite interesting that that's where you draw the line. That's the unforgivable, not necessarily like the capitalism that has made academia in some respects quite unforgivable or unforgiven to a lot of people, or that for example, there's a lot of like talking down to some people in philosophy constantly. How is it that we can even face ourselves when we realize that we are talking down to people that could actually teach us something too? I find it pretty odd because and quite arbitrary in both ends, but at the same time, I have to admit I'm new to the international philosophy scene, and maybe they have more history that I know about, but at the same time, it seemed to me quite idiosyncratic, quite out of place in respect to what they were talking about, that they faced each other in this way. Now, the next story that I kind of want to talk about is one in which I wasn't jumping between two philosophers to try to make a sort of connection or something of the sort. I was meeting a philosopher who I went to a conference for, actually. So this year I went to Derrida today, and it was quite interesting. I wrote more work that still took on the vein of how I said that I can do something personal in the midst of academia, and it still went okay. But there were a few things that were kind of interesting compared to the Poland conference. This one was a little bit less friendly in some respects. Like, people weren't out of their way being friends or kind of getting to know each other or going out for drinking parties together. People here were more reserved, which is kind of interesting because Derrida talks a lot about friendship and about hospitality. And that's not to say that like the organizers and a lot of people were hospitable, but it definitely felt felt different, and that's because I finally had a way of drawing contrast between these two conferences and a lot of different academic settings. In this occasion, one of the first figures that I knew about the top of my head going there was Drusilla Cornell, who I read some of her work on basically legal theory through a deconstructive and Lacanian psychoanalytic lens. And she done this kind of work under a feminist lens, I must add, because I think that's pretty important to her work. Before I even met her personally, or before I had a notion of what her work was and that she was going to be there, but I had not looked up her face or anything of the sort. It was during the first day that we both came into a panel on racism and colonialism that was fronted by white European people. Not to say that there's still a question of racism, that the question of racism is not in Europe, but it was, again, something that is pretty common, that like all the people of color or a lot of people that come from a lot of still under colonialism places were all in the back of just kind of taking a seat and listening up. I'm personally kind of a loud-mouthed asshole, so I decided that during the questions and answers sections, I would put a little bit of pressure on what these people were talking about. And a lot of them were struggling with answering my questions. Around this time, someone had walked into the room. A woman with long hair who had quite a way of dropping in, I guess. Just kind of sat in the back and kind of just watched. And when I was asking my questions and kind of pushing further, she also interjected and added that they were not answering my questions. So it was kind of interesting just looking back at the person that just walked in and seeing her just immediately pick up on the kind of conversation that was going on. And these people kind of started shying away from the conversation. I would later find out that they were all familiar with her and that was Drusilla Cornell. Towards the end of the day, we kind of were buddy-buddy with each other, and I was pretty excited to meet her. I still had no idea that it was Drusilla Cornell, actually. She introduced herself as Drusilla, but I still was clueless the entire time, and she presented herself to me and to Alexander, who was another of the keynote speakers, and we chatted for a while. They were very lovely people, and I still think it's kind of a shame of how things went a little bit later on in what I'm about to talk about. It was interesting, though, because Drusilla Cornell did help me out in that conversation, and at least make a point that these people were still involved in racism, and that even myths of the last word on racism are not going to be enough to face the question of still the material and everyday issues that people are facing. Academics oftentimes, myself included, sometimes forget that there's still someone besides ourselves that is still partaking in these issues, right? So even if we pretend that we have faced the myth of the last word of racism, it's not quite over. There's other people that might have to face that myth too, or whatnot. But yeah, kind of wrapping up this leading up to Drusilla Cornell. So I got to her keynote speaker presentation to realize that person that I was interacting with before was Drusilla Cornell. And she gave a presentation about techniques of liberation and the use of deconstruction towards that. And I learned a lot about Drusilla Cornell that I didn't know about then. First of all, that she has fought armedly for the Black Panthers and that she's done a lot of impressive work in labor. She's been an advocate for a lot of different communities, and I think that's still something that I respect about her, and that's very important to stress when I'm talking about her. So I have to start making a point of what happened there, and I had read her work before, so I was familiar with a line of reasoning that came up, particularly in respect to how is it that fantasy plays a role into how is it that we devise law. And her general point that appeared both in her book Beyond Accommodation and in her presentation was a little story about how when men were drawing laws about pregnancy, they still couldn't figure out the relationship between woman and pregnancy. In psychoanalytic terms, the fantasy of woman is just patching a hole in something they don't know. It's a patching a hole in not knowing, in what is indeterminate, in what is ungroundable in a certain sense. So when faced by this legal question, men couldn't figure out the relationship. And it is supposed by Cornell that in some way we have figured out that relationship. I definitely have to admit this is not my best formulation of the argument, but I don't think it needs to be right now for the sake of exploring para-academics. But I found it interesting too because I wanted to bring up something to the conversation. The question was not patching the hole in law, which I think was one of the central points to what Drusilla Cornell is trying to teach us about law, through a psychoanalytic and deconstructive lens, that we're going to find a hole in law, that the fabric of law is always dealing with some contingent element that makes it incomplete. And in the case of women, that becomes very evident when there's multiple gaps in how we treat issues of women. Now, the question that I brought up to her was that at the end of the day, trans men give birth. And this was a little bit of a non sequitur, but just to point out something about the question of the hole in law. That it's not that we're looking for a relationship between women and pregnancy, but we can also look at a relationship between men and pregnancy at this point. That if trans men give birth, and by that I mean a person who has transitioned from female to male, then we haven't actually patched the hole in law but merely displaced it, and the problem's still there. Now, it was interesting because my main point to Cornell was about the hole in the fabric of law that we're not patching it and merely displacing, and what kind of strategies can we take to face this displacement. That maybe a woman has figured out her relationship to pregnancy, but we still have disenfranchised trans men and trans health, for that matter, that is making it very difficult for people to live everyday life. And her response was interesting in that she started rambling around gender, not quite facing the question of legality or the holes to law. But it started becoming this discussion about gender, and she started discussing trans women, which may one day give birth, but right now that was not a question, it was about trans men. But she started talking about trans women, thinking that that's what I meant. So I clarified and elaborated the distinction, but even then she still went on to ramble about how gender is imaginary constructions, and how it is all reducible to the psychoanalytic imaginary. Now, as someone who engages with the question of trans experiences from a psychoanalytic perspective, I found that to be a quite inadequate response to the question in many respects, and one that actually puts at risk the material stakes of what trans health may mean for these people. What having actually an account of this displacement of the law could actually do to the benefit of people that are otherwise struggling with the material implications of that. And for someone who had done all that impressive work defending the Black Panthers and fighting in labor, it seemed disencouraging to see someone who has that much history being unable to respond, or even admit that maybe she doesn't know how to respond. You don't have to answer to all questions you're posed in a conference just because you are there on stage. Maybe you can admit that you don't quite know the answer to the question. And in fact, Drusilla Cornell, before the solo questions and answers section started, invited people to go hang out with her. So she could have very well told me, hey, I'm not sure if I understand your question. You can be one of those people that comes by after. Let's figure it out. And I would have loved that. I think that would have been, I would have loved to seen something like that happen, because what happened instead was quite disturbing, in the sense that after I had to clarify the distinction between trans men and trans women to Drusilla Cornell, and after I had to also realize that she started just spewing psychoanalysis in a very pure ideological sense, the only gestures that was left to me was pointing to my ear and just doing a little bit of a, I get it, I get it, I get it. But at the same time, people that understood that something went wrong in this conversation were starting to chat all around us. So it started becoming this occasion where I was immediately caught in one of those scandals like Nicolas de Varens and Bonnie Mons, where people noticed that there was like a fight between people. And I'm just a nobody who started basically putting this person who is very well known a little bit tense. And it was an odd circumstance because I could hear people still talking about like, oh, those identity politics people coming down to cause trouble, even though that was not even what I wanted to point out. But I could see people kind of fuming around, being like, oh, they're coming to ruin our party, us academics. We don't have to answer to anyone except ourselves. And then I had a few people approach me who realized, yeah, something went wrong there. She didn't actually answer your question at all. And that was a very important question. And some of these people actually took up Cornell's offer to go to her hotel and ask her questions after. I myself didn't, because I tried to go approach her after because I wanted to talk to her, that I was worried that put her under a lot of stress that she didn't need to be. And I was hoping that we could maybe just gone to the hotel and talk about the question. She didn't need to put the whole academic performance there. But She did, and I tried to go talk to her. She realized that I was there, but completely ignored me, because she went actually to talk to the people that were in that panel on post-colonialism and anti-racism, who were in a sense just all sucking up to her, and she was welcoming it all. So it was just really funny how I'd met her in a sense standing up for things, but I saw her also in a situation where she is also unforgiving in the sense that any academic with credentials and prestige has. I didn't see her there the day after. I don't know if she was planning on leaving the day after, anyways, or if people actually went to her hotel and asked her a lot about that, and she was fed up with it, so she didn't show. But it was my own personal occasion where I find myself caught up in the drama of academia, and that I noticed that a lot of it was unnecessary. A lot of it didn't need to still play the flaunting figure of the academic philosopher who has world renown and who has to seem like an authority at all times. Especially in a Derrida conference where the question of authority is always kind of under question and erasure. So it seemed odd. It seemed pretty odd. And so those are quite a few of the stories that have drawn me into this question of para-academics, seeing this constant tense interactions between different forms of very smart people, but very often time smart in such a way that it actually works against them. In the case of my old professor Strand, he couldn't even get a joke even though it was philosophically relevant to him to have understood the joke. And in the case of Drusilla Cornell, for all the work she's done to help out people, she's not willing to also be vulnerable in a sense that could maybe teach her something else, or that maybe we need to keep at heart when we're engaging with any sort of radical project. That we need to be able to face a community or people that are out of the community in some way or another still too. It was interesting going to these conferences. I may still go to them because I think it's important to make appearances that give hell to people who otherwise get a pass in just doing academic masturbatory bullshit. But it's important to work towards that, I guess, at least personally for myself. That being said, more and more so I started turning towards para-academics, and I especially started finding this through interdisciplinary works. I work at a music venue, and I work a lot with people in theater, people that do poetry, people that do visual arts. So I found myself in an interesting place to be able to do interdisciplinary work with these people. I've done performative theatric presentations on philosophy that have been more effective than I would have had an effect with just a lecture. I've used poetry because I've sometimes found it more effective at getting an immediate sense of an idea rather than just working the complexities of an idea. Sometimes the start is just with a poetic opening. And that's something I've realized time and again. That sometimes I don't need to use technical language. Sometimes I need to use a playful expression. And people will start getting it from those playful expressions. So theater and artists have definitely taught me a lot, and currently I'm going through this process where I'm starting to engage with people that are more involved in sciences or STEM, which I find funny because before I wanted to do anything with philosophy, I wanted to go hard into the physical sciences, but working with people that are working with sciences and STEM also bring up some interesting perspectives, and I think the question now is becoming more so how I said that these two, both scientific oriented people and those oriented towards the social and art, can find a meeting ground. I had an occasion where I went, for example, to experimental performance at an event called the Dare Buffet Cabaret, which takes place here in Edmonton. And at the Dare Buffet Cabaret, this time there was a painter who was also collaborating with some people working on neural networks, and they set up a neural network that would basically take through a camera, take the motions of her painting, and then render it into sound. So it was this interesting play between visual art, noise music, and computer engineering. It was this interesting mixture of work that I'm starting to find a lot with some movements of philosophy, like speculative realism or forms of accelerationism. It's interesting seeing this sort of hybridization of things that have otherwise had been at war with each other. And I think that's very important because I think one of the underlying problems that I've been trying to outline, particularly with academic philosophy, is that the academic philosophy limits in some way or another the means of expressions of philosophy, which in turn limits philosophy, and it's no longer anything liberatory at that point, especially if the end of philosophy is liberatory or liberatory in some sense. So by finding new means of expression for philosophy, for example in theater or in art or in cyberspace or virtuality, um, means something for what philosophy can be in a new way. And that's something that I think, particularly formulations that lead up to a speculative realism, like the work of Jacques Lacan or Gilles Deleuze, give us some intuitions of how to navigate those questions. The speculative realists are not necessarily hindered necessarily by a method or a critical approach, the same way that traditions after Kant are in phenomenology or in deconstruction, but it becomes more of kind of taking the real as if it is already there with you. Some people will write, for example, about all their experiences with nostalgia in the 80s. I think particularly Mark Fisher, who has written a book on capitalist realism, has gone on to do some work that, though some people don't necessarily call speculatively realist, not that everyone claims that label, his work starting to be part of something of that movement insofar as it's taking the freedom to explore already what you have with you. And that's important of these kinds of experimental works because they're starting to highlight also something about community outreach. When I'm doing philosophy, for example, in trying to do a podcast now, or in using memes or GIFs or video, or in trying to use words that are less fancy than what I do sometimes in writing, it's because the the test of philosophy now is how to think something other than yourself. But to think something other than myself, I can't have a method anymore because the method determines what that other than myself is too much. That's a problem that phenomenology is facing, for example, with its theological turn, where it's always determining too much what God is without just facing God, I guess, to say it quite playfully. That the question becomes how is it that we can think the other, but the struggle is that when I'm trying to think the other, I'm thinking the other in a way that is too much like me. And sometimes it's important to just kind of let go and just see in what occasions the other speaks his own piece. Sometimes silence is more important than speaking. So I think in instances like this end of phenomenology where it's turning towards a theological figure like God to think the other in such a radical sense, it still struggles with facing the other in everyday life, or that the others in such a way that it's already there. I don't need to think too much through it because it's there, and it's maybe speaking in a way that I'm only talking around it. How can I talk about what it's like to be my dog, or how can I talk about what it's like to be my bong? It's something that it starts being an important question nowadays, and I don't think analytic philosophy is able to start encountering that question quite head on, for example, because it hasn't gone through the same issues as the post-Kantian turn of the continental philosophical scene. I think in that respect they had to face this question how to think otherwise a lot more heavily. So in that respect, at least in North America, analytic philosophy needs to be able to account for others, I guess. To be able to account for something that is not itself, too. That there's not just the logical form. And I think that goes all the way back to Heidegger. But I think more than that, and more than just claiming that to say something philosophically, you need to do sufficient philosophy, is this question of what's already here with us. That I don't need to do sufficient philosophy to talk about what's here with me now. Yeah, going through the history of philosophy may help me figure out more ways of expressing that I wouldn't known otherwise. I think that's my main takeaway from my education in philosophy, that I learned to be more articulate in expressing myself. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. But at the same time, it also constrained me in other ways of expressing. And I think when I'm working at the music venue and teaching Hegel to someone in the parking lot with a cigarette butt, I learned something about expressing myself that I wouldn't have learned in academia. I wouldn't have been out there just bumming around with a cigarette butt and trying to explain like this high mighty figure as Hegel. If anything, I think there's some more merit in realizing that you can do that too. So this is a problem, and I think it's important to wrap up just again by noting that philosophy is currently through a crisis, and I think para academics is coming at a right time where it might open up what philosophy can be in a certain sense. I think I agree with people like Quentin Meillassoux that philosophy is reaching its saturation point and that the end of philosophy is pretty much here with us. But I think at the same time, the end of philosophy doesn't mean that it's the end of its expressions. And I think the question we're seeing now with the movement of speculative realism is a proliferation of non-academic philosophy, and also a proliferation of expressions of philosophy that we need right now. We need to find different ways of expressing, even if it means that philosophy is over and we're not doing necessarily creative work. But at the same time, sometimes by taking on the contemporary, we're doing something kind of creative. We have to start coming up with new jokes to tell our friends how is it that Hegel relates to this question or another. And that's kind of where the pressure is, I think, at least personally with para-academics. So just to wrap this up, this is an experiment. I don't really know what I'm doing here. I figured I should just start talking to a microphone and just telling a few stories about how is it that I'm doing what I'm doing right here. Philosophy is something I still have a very tense relationship with, especially now, because at one point I thought I would become a professor, and I thought I would stay in academia, and I thought that yeah, that would be it for me, right? Like philosophy is it. Philosophy gets it all. But more and more so, it's starting to be an issue that philosophy can be actually quite alienating. Philosophy is not all. And I think there's a way in which one can study philosophy and treat it as that not all. And I think it might be a more healthy way to approach it. I'm glad I took it very seriously. I'm glad I'm still taking it pretty seriously. But it's definitely taken a new place, especially in my heart, after I started considering para-academics and when I started actually facing my community, not being constantly at the university. And this is a problem that I'm trying to navigate in my life, with my friends, with the people around me, but also that it doesn't have to be just my circles. I can also learn from other people's circles too, and I think with navigating different people that are trying to do these kinds of projects of para-academics in different places, there's an opening up for learning about how to work and learn philosophy besides the institution in a way that it's a lot healthier, perhaps. So I know this is a little bit long. I've been talking for an hour, and I didn't know I could talk that long, but I kind of figured. I hope that this was informative in some sense, and I don't know if I'm gonna do it again. I kind of want to just to do an exercise in speaking. But yeah, I'll see you around.